The morning fog clung to the ancient towers of Thornwick Castle like secrets waiting to be unveiled. King Edward VII stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching as the groundskeepers moved across the manicured lawns below. At 68, his once dark hair had turned silver, and the weight of 23 years on the throne had carved deep lines around his eyes. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of his private secretary, Margaret Whitmore. She had served the royal household for over 3 decades and had become more than just an employee. She was a trusted confidant who had witnessed the family's most intimate moments and guarded their deepest secrets. "Enter, Margaret," Edward called without turning from the window. He heard the soft click of her heels on the marble floor as she approached. "Sir, there's been a development regarding the archived materials from the late Princess Isabella's estate," Margaret said carefully, her voice carrying an unusual tension that made Edward finally turn to face her. Princess Isabella. Even now, 15 years after the tragic accident that claimed her life, hearing her name still sent a sharp pang through Edward's chest. Isabella had been his daughter-in-law, married to his eldest son, Prince Alexander, for 12 tumultuous years before her death in that terrible car crash in the tunnel beneath the Thames Bridge. "What kind of development?" Edward asked, settling into the leather chair behind his mahogany desk. The morning light, streaming through the windows, caught the gold threads and the royal crest embroidered on the chair's headrest. Margaret placed a manila folder on the desk before him. "The National Archives contacted us yesterday evening. During their routine digitization process of historical documents, they discovered a sealed collection that was apparently misfiled. The contents," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "appear to be personal documents belonging to Princess Isabella. Letters, diary entries, and what seems to be audio recordings." Edward's blood ran cold. After Isabella's death, every effort had been made to collect and secure her personal effects. The royal family had been assured that all potentially sensitive materials were either destroyed or safely archived under the highest security protocols. The existence of undiscovered documents was not just unexpected. It was potentially catastrophic. "How is this possible?" Edward's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having answers immediately. According to the archives director, Dr. Henley, the documents were sealed by Isabella herself shortly before her death. They were labeled with instructions that they should remain unopened for 15 years. The seal was only broken yesterday, when the 15-year period expired. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Edward stared at the folder as if it might burst into flames. Isabella had been known for her intelligence and her sometimes unsettling ability to plan ahead. If she had hidden documents with a 15-year seal, it meant she had anticipated something, perhaps even her own death. "Has anyone else seen these materials?" Edward asked. Dr. Henley glanced through them briefly to determine their nature and significance. He immediately contacted the palace when he realized what he had found. According to him, the contents are, Margaret hesitated, quite revealing regarding the internal dynamics of the royal family during Princess Isabella's marriage to Prince Alexander. Prince Alexander, Edward's eldest son and heir to the throne. The relationship between Alexander and Isabella had been the subject of intense public fascination and private family concern. What had begun as a fairy tale romance, the handsome prince and the beautiful commoner who captured his heart, had deteriorated into something much darker behind closed doors. The public had seen the glamorous couple at state dinners and charity galas, always perfectly presented and seemingly devoted to each other. But within the palace walls, their marriage had been a storm of arguments, long silences, and barely concealed resentment. Isabella had struggled to adapt to royal life, while Alexander had grown increasingly frustrated with her independence and what he saw as her defiance of royal protocol. "Where is Alexander now?" Edward asked. "His Royal Highness is in Scotland, sir, attending the Highland Games with Princess Catherine. They're not scheduled to return until Thursday." Catherine was Alexander's second wife, married 3 years after Isabella's death. The marriage had been carefully arranged to restore stability to Alexander's life and provide the crown with a more manageable princess. Catherine was everything Isabella had not been: compliant, traditional, and utterly devoted to maintaining the royal image. Edward opened the folder with trembling fingers. The first document was a handwritten letter dated just 2 weeks before Isabella's death. Her elegant script filled the page. "My dearest Thomas," it began. Thomas Blackwood. Edward remembered him well. He had been Isabella's closest friend and confidant, a journalist who had covered the royal family with both respect and integrity. After Isabella's death, he had left royal reporting entirely and now lived quietly in the countryside. Edward continued reading. "I fear that my time is running shorter than I had hoped. The pressure has become unbearable, and I sense that certain members of the family view me as more of a liability than an asset. I have decided to document everything, not out of spite, but because the truth deserves to be preserved. These recordings and letters contain information that could change how history remembers not just me, but all of us." The letter went on to detail Isabella's concerns about the royal family's handling of various scandals, including cover-ups of Alexander's gambling debts and his affair with a French ambassador's wife. But more troubling were her references to the pressure campaign designed to force her into a more submissive role, and her growing fear that she was being monitored and possibly manipulated by palace officials. Edward set the letter aside and picked up the next document, a transcript of what appeared to be a secretly recorded conversation between Isabella and Alexander. The date stamp showed it was recorded just 1 week before her death. "You can't continue to embarrass the family like this, Isabella." Alexander's voice came through clearly on the transcript. "Your charity work with those refugees is causing diplomatic problems. Father is furious. Since when is helping suffering people an embarrassment?" Isabella had responded. "These people need aid, Alexander. They need someone with a platform to speak for them. They need to stay in their own countries and solve their own problems. Your bleeding heart is making us look weak. The Prime Minister has asked me to speak with you about this." "The Prime Minister?" Isabella's voice carried surprise and hurt. "You've been discussing my activities behind my back with government officials." "I discuss everything that affects the crown with the appropriate people. That includes your increasingly erratic behavior." "Erratic behavior?" "Alexander, I'm trying to use my position to actually help people instead of just cutting ribbons and smiling for photographs. If that's erratic, then I'm proud to be erratic." "You're proud to be a problem, you mean?" "Father warned me this would happen when I marry a commoner. He said you'd never truly understand your duties." The transcript continued for several more pages, revealing the deep fractures in their marriage and the intense pressure Isabella faced from the royal establishment. Edward felt his chest tighten as he read Alexander's increasingly harsh words and Isabella's desperate attempts to defend herself. But the most shocking revelation came in a diary entry dated 3 days before Isabella's death. "I've made my decision. Thomas has agreed to help me establish a foundation separate from the royal charities. I plan to announce my intention to step back from official duties and focus on independent humanitarian work. Alexander will be furious, and the king will likely see it as a betrayal, but I cannot continue to live this lie. I am suffocating under the weight of their expectations and their constant surveillance. I've documented everything in case something happens to me. I'm not being paranoid. The palace security team has been asking strange questions about my schedule and my friends. Someone accessed my private email account last week, and I know it wasn't a random hacker. I've started varying my routes when driving and asked Thomas to keep copies of my most important documents. If these files are being read, it means either I found the courage to reveal the truth myself, or something prevented me from doing so. Either way, the world deserves to know that Princess Isabella was not the unstable, attention-seeking woman the palace portrayed her to be. I was a woman who tried to use her position to make a difference, and who was systematically destroyed for refusing to stay silent and compliant. Edward's hands shook as he finished reading. The implications of Isabella's words were staggering. If her fears were justified, if she had indeed been under surveillance or pressure from within the royal establishment, then her death might not have been the simple accident it had been ruled to be. Margaret had been waiting silently while Edward reviewed the documents. Now she cleared her throat gently. "Sir, there's more. The audio recordings haven't been transcribed yet, but Dr. Henley mentioned that some appear to be conversations with high-ranking palace officials. There are also photographs and what looks like financial records." Financial records? Edward's voice was barely a whisper. Payments made from discretionary royal accounts to various private security firms and public relations companies. The amounts are significant, and the timing corresponds with the period when Princess Isabella was becoming more outspoken about various issues. The weight of the revelation settled over Edward like a heavy cloak. If these documents became public, they wouldn't just damage Alexander's reputation. They could potentially bring down the entire monarchy. The British people had loved Isabella, and news that she had been systematically pressured and possibly surveilled by her own family would create a scandal unlike anything the royal family had ever faced. But beyond the political implications, Edward was grappling with a more personal horror. Had his own son, his heir, been involved in driving Isabella to her death? Had the royal establishment that Edward had spent his entire life serving become so focused on control and image that it had destroyed an innocent woman? A new knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. This time it was his younger son, Prince William, who entered without waiting for permission. At 35, William had always been the more thoughtful and sensitive of Edward's two sons. He had genuinely loved Isabella as a sister-in-law and had been devastated by her death. "Father, I've just heard from Margaret about the archived documents," William said, his face pale with concern. "Is it true? Has something been found?" Edward looked at his younger son, seeing the hope and fear warring in his eyes. William had never fully believed the official story about Isabella's accident. He had asked uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of her death, questions that had been firmly discouraged by the family and eventually dropped. "Sit down, William," Edward said heavily. "We need to talk." As William settled into the chair across from the desk, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He would not allow Isabella's truth to be buried again. Whatever the cost to the family, to the monarchy, or to his own legacy, the secrets that had been hidden for 15 years were finally going to see the light. "Your sister-in-law left us a message," Edward said quietly, sliding the folder across the desk. "And I'm afraid it's going to change everything we thought we knew about her death." The morning fog had lifted from the castle grounds, but inside the royal study, a different kind of storm was just beginning to gather. The 15-year silence was over, and the truth about Princess Isabella was about to emerge from the shadows where it had been buried. As William began to read the documents, his expression shifted from confusion to shock to barely contained rage. The perfect facade of the royal family was about to crack, and Edward knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. Isabella had made sure of that with her careful planning. The question was whether the monarchy could survive the revelation of what the House of Windsor had done to one of its own. Outside, the sun continued to rise over the ancient castle, but inside, the royal family was about to face its darkest hour. The ghost of Princess Isabella was finally ready to speak. #Royal Secrets. Part 2. Prince William's face had drained of all color as he read through Isabella's documents. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the final page, and when he looked up at his father, there was a mixture of grief and fury in his eyes that Edward had never seen before. "She knew," William whispered, his voice barely audible. "She knew they were watching her, pressuring her, and she documented it all." He stood abruptly, beginning to pace the length of the study. "Father, we have to do something about this. We can't let this stay buried." Edward watched his younger son with growing concern. William had always been the moral compass of the family, the one who questioned decisions and pushed for transparency when others preferred secrecy. But this situation was more complex than William realized. "Son, You need to understand the implications of what you're suggesting, Edward said carefully. If we release these documents, we're not just exposing Alexander or certain palace officials. We're potentially destroying the monarchy itself. The public's faith in the institution. The public's faith should be destroyed. William interrupted, his composure finally breaking. Father, if even half of what Isabella wrote is true, then we've been lying to the entire nation for 15 years. We've let them believe she was an unstable woman who died in a tragic accident, when in reality, she was being systematically tormented by her own family. Before Edward could respond, the study door burst open. Prince Alexander strode in, still wearing his traveling clothes from his unexpected return from Scotland. His dark hair was disheveled, and there was a dangerous look in his eyes that Edward recognized from Alexander's childhood tantrums. I received a call from my security detail about some kind of emergency at the palace, Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Something about archived documents and urgent family meetings. What's going on? The three men stood in silence for a moment, the tension in the room palpable. Edward realized that this was the moment of truth, literally. How he handled the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of these revelations, but the future of his entire family. William picked up a folder from the desk and held it out to his older brother. These are Isabella's documents, Alexander. The ones she sealed before her death. They've just been opened. Alexander's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, recognition, and then something that looked very much like fear. He made no move to take the folder. I don't know what you're talking about, Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. She recorded your conversations, Alexander, William said quietly. The arguments, the threats, the pressure campaigns. She documented the surveillance, the manipulation, everything. That's impossible, Alexander replied. But he had taken a step back toward the door. Isabella was mentally unstable. Everyone knew that. Her paranoid delusions about being watched were part of her psychological breakdown. Were they delusions? William's voice was rising. Because according to these documents, palace security was indeed monitoring her activities. According to these financial records, significant payments were made to private investigation firms during the exact period when she claimed to be under surveillance. Alexander's mask of denial finally slipped. The careful composure he had maintained for 15 years cracked, revealing the desperate man underneath. You don't understand, he said, his voice becoming defensive. She was out of control. The refugee charity work, the unauthorized statements to the press, the meetings with journalists without palace approval. She was damaging the crown's reputation and creating diplomatic incidents. Something had to be done. Something had to be done. William repeated incredulously. Alexander, are you listening to yourself? She was your wife. She was trying to help people. She was trying to destroy everything our family has built. Alexander shouted, his composure completely gone now. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your wife systematically undermine your authority and embarrass your family on the world stage? She wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't accept guidance, wouldn't conform to the role she had agreed to take on when she married into this family. Edward had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. His worst fears were being confirmed. Not only had Alexander been involved in the pressure campaign against Isabella, but he clearly felt justified in his actions. Tell me about the surveillance, Edward said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. Tell me exactly what you authorized. Alexander looked trapped, glancing between his father and brother. Finally, he collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. It started small, he admitted. Just basic security monitoring. Isabella was receiving threats from various extremist groups because of her refugee advocacy. We told ourselves we were protecting her. But it expanded, William prompted, his voice cold. She was meeting with people we didn't know, having conversations we couldn't monitor. The security team recommended expanding the surveillance to include her personal communications and daily activities. I approved it. You approved spying on your own wife, Edward said, the disgust clear in his voice. I approved protecting the crown. Alexander shot back. She was planning to establish an independent foundation that would have directly competed with royal charities. She was giving interviews to journalists without clearing her statements through the palace press office. She was becoming a loose cannon. She was becoming independent, William corrected. She was trying to use her position to actually make a difference instead of just being a decorative figurehead. The room fell silent again. Edward walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where tourists were gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Those people trusted the royal family to represent the best of British values: honor, service, dignity. How could he tell them that those same values had been betrayed from within? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret entered with another folder, her face grave. "Sir, Dr. Henley from the National Archives has sent over the preliminary transcripts of the audio recordings," she said. "I think you need to see this immediately." Edward took the folder with resignation. Each new revelation seemed worse than the last. He opened it to find a transcript marked recording number 78, 3 days before Princess Isabella's death. The transcript showed a conversation between Isabella and someone identified only as Palace Official A. Edward began to read. "Your Royal Highness, we need to discuss your upcoming schedule changes." "What schedule changes?" "I wasn't informed of any changes. The charity visit to the refugee center has been canceled. There are security concerns." "What kind of security concerns?" "I was just there last week without any problems. The situation has become more volatile. Additionally, your interview with the BBC about the foundation has been postponed indefinitely." "Postponed by whom?" "I didn't agree to postpone anything. The decision has been made at the highest levels." "Your Royal Highness, perhaps it would be better if you focused on your official duties and left the independent initiatives for a later time." "A later time? This is my life's work we're talking about. These refugees need help now, not at some vague future date when the palace decides it's convenient." "Your Royal Highness, I must be frank with you. There are concerns about your recent behavior. The family is considering intervention." "What kind of intervention?" "Professional help. Treatment for stress and adjustment disorders. A temporary withdrawal from public duties while you receive the care you need." "You're talking about having me committed." "We're talking about helping you through a difficult period. By locking me away and declaring me mentally unfit, just because I won't be the silent, obedient princess you want me to be." "Your Royal Highness, please understand that this comes from a place of love and concern." "Love and concern?" "You've been spying on me for months. You've been sabotaging my work and controlling my schedule. You've turned my husband against me and isolated me from my friends. If this is love, then I want nothing to do with it." Edward set the transcript down with shaking hands. The conversation revealed something far worse than surveillance or pressure. It revealed an active plan to have Isabella declared mentally incompetent and removed from public life entirely. "Alexander," Edward said quietly, "were you aware of plans to have Isabella institutionalized?" Alexander's face went white. That was never seriously considered. It was just one option that was discussed if her behavior became more erratic. "Her behavior wasn't erratic," William said, his voice deadly calm. "She was fighting for her independence and her right to use her position meaningfully. And you were planning to have her locked up for it." "She was going to announce the foundation the day after she died," Margaret said quietly, consulting her notes. According to her calendar, she had a press conference scheduled to announce her withdrawal from official royal duties and the establishment of an independent humanitarian organization. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Isabella had been planning to break free from royal control entirely, and the palace had been preparing to stop her by any means necessary, including having her declared mentally incompetent. "The financial records," Edward said suddenly. "Show me the financial records." Margaret produced another folder from her briefcase. The documents inside detailed payments to various private security firms, public relations companies, and what appeared to be medical professionals. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of pounds have been spent on what the records euphemistically called family security and wellness initiatives. But the most damning document was a contract with a private psychiatric facility, dated just 1 week before Isabella's death. The contract outlined terms for the discreet residential treatment of a high-profile patient requiring privacy and specialized care for stress-related disorders and adjustment difficulties. The facility was located in a remote part of Switzerland, far from media attention and public scrutiny. The contract included provisions for indefinite treatment duration and extremely limited contact with outside parties. They were going to disappear her, Williams said, his voice filled with horror. They were going to have her declared mentally ill and locked away in Switzerland where no one could find her or hear her story. Edward felt physically ill. The monarchy he had spent his life serving and protecting had become something monstrous. The institution he had inherited from his father and planned to pass to his son had been corrupted into a machine that destroyed anyone who threatened its control. "Alexander," Edward said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment, "did you sign this contract?" Alexander wouldn't meet his father's eyes. The advisor said it was the only way to protect both Isabella and the crown. They said she was having a breakdown and needed professional help. She wasn't having a breakdown, Williams said. She was planning her escape, and you were planning to stop her by having her imprisoned. It wasn't imprisonment. Alexander protested. It was treatment. Medical care. For what illness? William demanded. What medical condition did Isabella have that required being locked away in a Swiss facility with no contact with the outside world? Alexander had no answer. The truth was obvious to everyone in the room. Isabella's only illness had been her refusal to submit to royal control. Edward walked to his desk and picked up the phone. "Margaret, please contact Dr. Henley at the National Archives. Tell him that I want every document, recording, and photograph in that collection brought to the palace immediately. Then, contact the Attorney General. I need to speak with him today." "Father, what are you doing?" Alexander asked, panic creeping into his voice. "I'm doing what I should have done 15 years ago," Edward replied. "I'm finding out the truth about what happened to Isabella, and I'm making sure that truth is revealed." "You can't be serious about making this public," Alexander said desperately. "Think about the consequences. Think about the monarchy." "I am thinking about the monarchy," Edward replied. "And I'm realizing that an institution built on lies and cover-ups doesn't deserve to survive." The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows now, but the royal study felt shrouded in darkness. 15 years of carefully maintained lies were crumbling, and the truth about Princess Isabella was finally emerging from the shadows. As Edward prepared to take the first steps toward revealing the shocking conspiracy that had led to Isabella's death, he wondered if the monarchy could survive such a revelation. But he also knew that some truths were more important than institutions, and some justice was worth any price. The ghost of Princess Isabella was about to have her voice heard, and nothing would ever be the same again. #Royal Secrets. Part 3. The Attorney General, Sir Harrison Blackwell, arrived at the palace within 2 hours of King Edward's urgent summons. A distinguished man in his mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Blackwell had served 3 different governments and was known for his unwavering commitment to justice, regardless of political consequences. Edward received him in the same study where the morning's revelations had unfolded, but now the room felt different, charged with the electricity of impending change. The Isabella documents were spread across the mahogany desk like evidence in a crime scene, which Edward was beginning to realize they essentially were. "Your Majesty," Blackwell said as he took a seat across from the king, "your message indicated this was a matter of utmost urgency involving potential criminal activity within the royal household." "Harrison," Edward began, using the familiar form of address that indicated the gravity of the situation, "what I'm about to show you will likely result in criminal charges against members of my own family. I need you to understand that I'm prepared for those consequences." Blackwell's eyebrows rose slightly. In 30 years of serving the crown, he had never heard a monarch speak with such resignation about potential criminal activity within the royal family. Edward handed him the folder containing Isabella's documents. Princess Isabella sealed these files before her death 15 years ago. They were only opened yesterday, and they reveal a conspiracy that goes far beyond marital problems or palace politics. As Blackwell read through the documents, his expression grew increasingly grave. When he reached the psychiatric facility contract, he set the papers down and looked directly at Edward. "Your Majesty, if these documents are authentic, they suggest a criminal conspiracy involving kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, fraud, and potentially much worse." "Much worse?" Edward asked, though he suspected he already knew what Blackwell was thinking. The timing of Princess Isabella's death, combined with her documented fears about her safety and the evidence of this planned institutionalization, raises serious questions about whether her car accident was indeed accidental. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Edward had been trying to avoid reaching the same conclusion, but the evidence was overwhelming. Isabella had been planning to escape royal control by announcing her independence and establishing her own foundation. The palace had been preparing to stop her by having her declared mentally incompetent and imprisoned in Switzerland. 3 days after learning about these plans, she was dead in what appeared to be a convenient accident. "I want a full investigation," Edward said quietly. "Whatever the consequences, wherever the evidence leads, I want the truth." Before Blackwell could respond, the study door opened and Princess Catherine entered. Alexander's second wife moved with the careful grace that came from years of royal training. But there was something different about her demeanor today, a tension that suggested she knew about the morning's discoveries. "Your Majesty," Catherine said, curtsying to Edward before nodding to Blackwell. "Alexander told me about the documents. I think there are some things you should know." Edward studied his daughter-in-law carefully. Catherine had always been the perfect royal wife. Beautiful, compliant, never causing problems or raising uncomfortable questions. But now there was a resolve in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of Isabella. "What things, Catherine?" Catherine moved to the window, looking out at the palace grounds before speaking. "Isabella contacted me," she said quietly. 2 weeks before her death, she reached out to me even though we had never met. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Edward and Blackwell exchanged shocked glances. "What did she say?" Edward asked. Catherine turned back to face them, her composed facade beginning to crack. "She said she needed someone outside the family to know the truth in case something happened to her. She told me about the surveillance, about the plans to have her institutionalized, about the pressure campaign. Why didn't you come forward with this information?" Blackwell asked, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "Because I was terrified," Catherine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Isabella died 3 days after contacting me, I realized that crossing the royal family could be fatal. So I stayed quiet, married Alexander when I was asked to, and played the perfect princess." "But why are you speaking now?" Edward asked. Catherine straightened, finding her strength. "Because I've been watching Alexander for 3 years, and I've seen what guilt and paranoia can do to a person. He drinks too much, has nightmares, and sometimes talks in his sleep about things that happened 15 years ago. I think he knows more about Isabella's death than anyone realizes." Edward felt the ground shifting beneath him. His eldest son, his heir, might not just have been involved in a conspiracy to institutionalize Isabella. He might have been involved in her actual murder. A commotion outside the study drew their attention. Through the windows, they could see several black vehicles with government license plates pulling up to the palace gates. Blackwell checked his phone and nodded grimly. "The investigative team I called for," he explained. "Forensic accountants, digital evidence specialists, and detective from the Metropolitan Police's Special Crimes Unit. Your Majesty, once they begin their work, there will be no stopping this investigation." Edward looked around the room, at the documents that had started everything, at Catherine, who had finally found the courage to speak, at Blackwell, who represented the inexorable machinery of justice. In a few minutes, police investigators would be crawling through the palace, examining financial records, interviewing staff, and treating the royal family like any other suspects in a criminal investigation. "Where is Alexander now?" Edward asked. "In the West Wing with his private secretary," Catherine replied. "He's been making phone calls all afternoon, to lawyers, to former palace officials, to people I don't recognize. He's trying to coordinate his defense, Blackwell observed, or possibly destroying evidence. The study door burst open again, and this time it was Prince William, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was a man Edward recognized but hadn't seen in 15 years, Thomas Blackwood, the journalist who had been Isabella's closest friend and confidant. Thomas looked older than his 53 years, with gray threading through his brown hair and lines of grief etched around his eyes. But there was also a sense of purpose about him, as if he had been waiting 15 years for this moment. "Father," William said urgently, "I contacted Thomas after reading Isabella's documents. There are things he needs to tell us." Thomas stepped forward, pulling a digital recorder from his pocket. "Your Majesty, Isabella gave me copies of some of her most important recordings. She asked me to keep them safe and only reveal them if something happened to her." Edward's heart sank. More evidence, more proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed Isabella and threatened to destroy his family. "Play them," Edward said simply. Thomas activated the recorder, and Isabella's voice filled the room, clear, determined, and heartbreakingly alive. "Thomas, if you're listening to this, it means that my fears were justified and that I'm no longer here to tell my own story. I need you to know that everything I've documented is true. The surveillance, the pressure, the plans to have me institutionalized, it's all real." There was a pause, and when Isabella continued, her voice was thick with emotion. "But there's something else, something I haven't put in the written documents because it's too dangerous. Alexander isn't just going along with the palace conspiracy, he's driving it. 3 days ago, I overheard him on a phone call with someone discussing permanent solutions to the Isabella problem. When he saw me listening, he said they were talking about the Swiss facility, but the conversation I heard was about something much more final." Edward's blood turned to ice. His son, his heir, had been discussing permanent solutions to Isabella's independence. The recording continued. "I'm scared, Thomas. Really scared. Not just of being locked away, but of what Alexander might do to prevent me from revealing what I know. He's not the man I married. The palace has changed him into something cold and calculating. If something happens to me in the next few days, please make sure people know it wasn't an accident." The recording ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. Thomas looked around at their shocked faces before speaking. "She called me the night before she died. She said Alexander had been acting strangely, asking detailed questions about her schedule and her route to the charity event. She was planning to drive herself that night instead of using the palace driver, but Alexander insisted she take the official car." "The official car," Blackwell repeated slowly. "The one that crashed. The one that had just been serviced by a private garage that had never worked on royal vehicles before," Thomas added. "I researched it after Isabella's death. The garage had connections to some of the same security firms that were being paid by the palace. The implications were staggering. Not only had Isabella been under surveillance and facing forced institutionalization, but her death might have been orchestrated through sabotage of her vehicle." Catherine had been listening with growing horror. Now, she spoke up. "Alexander still has nightmares about that night. Sometimes he wakes up saying things like the brakes, and it wasn't supposed to happen like that." "What do you mean, wasn't supposed to happen like that?" Blackwell asked, his prosecutor's instincts fully engaged. I think maybe the plan was just to disable the car, to make her miss her public appearance, so they could claim she was having a breakdown. But something went wrong, and instead of just a minor accident, she was killed." The room erupted in voices as everyone began to speak at once, but Edward held up his hand for silence. The weight of 15 years of lies and cover-ups was crushing him, but beneath the despair was a growing determination to see justice done. "Blackwell," Edward said firmly, "I want Alexander arrested immediately. I want the car crash reinvestigated. I want every palace official from that period questioned under oath." "Your Majesty," Blackwell replied carefully, "arresting the heir to the throne on suspicion of murdering his wife will create a constitutional crisis unlike anything Britain has ever faced." "Then, so be it," Edward said. "Some things are more important than constitutional stability. Through the windows, they could see the investigative team setting up their equipment on the palace grounds. News vans were already gathering at the gates, somehow having gotten word that something major was happening at the palace. Prince William walked to his father's side. "I'll support whatever decision you make," he said quietly. "Isabella deserves justice, even if it destroys us." Catherine nodded in agreement. "She saved my life by warning me about what this family was capable of. The least I can do is help expose the truth about what happened to her." Thomas pocketed his recorder and looked directly at Edward. "Your Majesty, Isabella believed that the monarchy could be a force for good in the world if it was held accountable for its actions. She died trying to reform it from within. Maybe her death can still serve that purpose." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the palace grounds, Edward made the decision that would change everything. He picked up the phone and dialed the direct line to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. "This is King Edward," he said when the call was answered. "I need to report a murder. The victim was Princess Isabella, and the prime suspect is my son, Prince Alexander. The ghost of Princess Isabella was about to have her justice, and the British monarchy was about to face its greatest test in centuries. The truth had been buried for 15 years, but now it was rising from the grave with a vengeance that would shake the very foundations of the crown.